And today we will talk about public areas. How should public spaces, we'll be talking about how should public spaces areas be designed in order to not lead to reduced accessibility of people with visual and impairment and the blind people. And what you should think about so that the environment can be of help for visually impaired and the blind to carry out this complicated task of orientation. How do we define a public area or external environment, as we might as well call it? So, by external environments, we mean either the environment around buildings or any public surface that is open to the public use. So it might be parks, schoolyards, playgrounds, any other open spaces, but also pedestrian spaces and street crossings. For most of us, outdoor places are very important. If we live in a city, parks and playgrounds, squares, and open spaces play quite big role in our lives. In school, the schoolyard is very important. Out in nature, outdoor areas, public beaches, for example, and other places are important for our well-being. So you should really ensure that everyone, also people with visual impairment and the blind, can also visit those places and enjoy them to the full extent of an equal basis with others. And this you can do by properly marking them, ensuring good navigation, creating good navigation pathways, natural ones, for example, in the parks. That's the easiest thing to do. Removing the clutter, etc. When we make such places available, the study shows that it has a positive effects arise. Accessible places are often perceived as more safe and secure, and they very often as well make it easier to use them. For example, when it's dark or during the winter. I think it's safe to say that majority of people, despite if someone has an impairment or not, we are all overwhelmed in public areas. There is many different things that are happening at the same time and in a shared space. I myself, for example, can feel myself very stressed if I'm on the streets where is a lot of people running and passing me by. And for visually impaired persons to be able to use the public areas on equal terms with others, with sighted people, you must carefully design them. That's really important. A person with a visual impairment experiences the change of surroundings right down to the smallest detail. And any change can be experienced as very challenging and often as frightening or dissuasive. There are different elements that can create this, that can change, for example, like excavations or scaffoldings or bicycles, which are placed on all leads and edges of the pavement. Bicycles that are locked to lampposts or railings. I mentioned earlier electrical scooters as well, lying around everywhere, or the tables, cafeteria tables that are just standing everywhere without proper marking, just to lock people to them. These are all the elements that of the changed pattern. They're changing the pattern for people with disability, with visual impairment and the blind. This makes it difficult to navigate around, especially for the target groups. Because as we were talking yesterday, and I think even on day one, the blind and the visually impaired people, they they rely on the pattern, they rely on the order and structure and predictability. They use bearing markers and identification marks, like for example, the paving stone in the sidewalk or a cobblestone driveway. They navigate by the sounds of, for example, some kind of jug box in the cafeteria, or smells from the cafeteria, and so on, as well as a sense of how far down a sidewalk they have to go in order to find a corner or a bus stop, etc. So obstacles and unexpected setups, like a pile of bikes or electrical scooters that suddenly lying around there, they break the rhythm and pattern that the blind and visually impaired person uses to navigate, and can knock that person completely out of course. So the big question is how you should design the public spaces so that they are safe and easy to navigate around independently, because that's the key word, as you can remember. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I will focus on the pedestrian spaces and street crossings, because they can be the most challenging. So pedestrian spaces. For orientation, independence, and safety reasons, you must ensure that the separation between the pedestrian and non-pedestrian spaces are clearly marked. And again, this should be done both visually and tactile. So both the people with visual impairment can spot the change, but also the blind people can actually feel it. So the visual marking is often high contrasting colors, while the tactile markings can vary depending on the can vary and depending on the surroundings surface. The most efficient way to mark the difference between the street and the pavement is by difference in height. For wheelchair users, people with baby strollers, for example, or suitcases on wheels, we were as well talking about earlier, as well as for service vehicles, curb ramps can be provided, are very often created, but this may make it hard for visually impaired to understand where the pavement stops and the street starts. This is a sort of a conflict between two different disability groups, and we will talk about it. Actually, we will address it a little bit later today. So, guiding lines. A guiding line is a coherent tactile coating strip that differs significantly from its adjacent surroundings in contrasting color, height, and surface structure. When guiding lines are laid out and integrated correctly in the environment, it is of great help to the blind people and visually impaired persons. A good and useful guiding line with integrated attention fields involves both the senses of hearing and sight. It must be possible to follow the guiding line using the residual sight. So people who are visually impaired, they should be able to see it with the little vision they have left. It should be possible to navigate with the white cane and tactily through the sole of the shoe. If there is a sound difference when touching the guideline and the surrounding coating with the white cane, this is of extra help, because this allows the blind people and visually impaired people to use even their hearing to navigate. Yes, street crossings. But let's a short introduction first. Accessibility for people with visual impairment can be a major challenge in places where driving traffic has to be crossed. So it can be difficult for the blind or partially sighted person to find directly across the opposite side of the road and not accidentally end up in the middle of a street, for example, or intersection. It is because the engine noise of a passing car can obscure the sound of a car driving behind it, for example. The bicycles you barely can hear them. The same with the electric cars nowadays, they are as well a problem. If there are no other pedestrians nearby, the visually impaired or the blind person is completely left to their own senses. So to ensure good accessibility and safety for the blind and partially sighted, it is therefore of great importance that road junctions and regulated crossings are planned and arranged in a way that it's clear where and how the road can be crossed safely. Techniques and cues used in crossing streets are diverse and vary by the type of location and by the individual and his or her level of vision and preferred mobility strategy, of course. Visually impaired persons often travel to unfamiliar areas and intersections, and they depend on gathering information from available sources on the way in order to be able to move safely. Once pedestrians who are, for example, blind or visually impaired are familiar with an intersection, they do not usually need to analyze the intersection and traffic control system at length every time. However, they still may need to listen for a long time, or it's longer time, that's enough to determine that they are at the correct location and that the signal is functioning as usual. Pedestrians who are blind will still need to detect the street, a line to cross, identify the interval where pedestrians are allowed to walk, and maintain alignment while crossing. There is something that's called Accessible Pedestrian Signal, APS, and they are useful to assist with the task of identifying the walk interval at familiar and unfamiliar locations. An accessible pedestrian signal is a pedestrian, they might look a little bit differently in different countries. It might be, for example, a push button that communicates when to cross the street in a non-visual manner, such as audible tones, speech messages, or vibrating surfaces. So, I think you could recognize some of the issues people in the movie pinpointed from our previous discussions, for example, when we're talking about the guide dog. But just to summarize a bit, they were talking about APS, Accessible Pedestrian Signal. In Great Britain, it was a spinning cone in the bottom. But as I said, it might be different things. It might be a well-marked button, for example. That they were talking about that it's very important that they are actually curbs and that the difference between mark, so that curb heights mark the end of the footpath. It's important that tactile markings are associated with the crossing, that they just don't end up wherever in empty space. It's important that the crossings are controlled, which is safer for the blind and visually impaired people. And that it's important to keep separated spaces for cyclists. That's something we were talking about earlier, as you can remember.